Welcome everybody to the Research Triangle PowerShell user group. We're here with Jeremy Brown.
Hey everyone.
This is part 2 of his Azure Bicep talk. Our first talk was in August. That should already be posted if you're watching this on YouTube. If you want to watch that part first and then catch up with this part afterwards. For now, Jeremy Brown, and he's going to tell us a little bit about what he's doing and then get into his presentation. Jeremy, take it away.
Hey, how's it going, everybody? I'm Jeremy. I work for a large manufacturing company. We have vacated on-premises data centers and moved everything into Azure. And so my job primarily consists with the plumbing, quote unquote, within Azure, building resources for all kinds of stuff, supporting data scientists, RVMs, all sorts of things. And so I thought it'd be fun to have a talk about using Bicep instead of ARM. I think Bicep is way easier to pick up and use. And so when I'm building it, it quickly, became a larger thing. And so we decided to break it into two parts. So the first part that I gave through was more around the syntax and structure of Bicep and how Bicep builds an ARM template and how we deploy the ARM template. We kept the deployments pretty simple on the first part and really just stuck to the basics of understanding how Bicep works. This talk is going to build on that, and we're going to start looking at more real-worldy approaches to the way that you deploy templates and some of the things that you have to take into account and consider as you work through. So I strongly encourage you, if you're new to Bicep, to go watch the first one first before watching this one. Otherwise, this one's probably going to get a little muddy for you. So with that, I thought we might start with a little bit of a review of what we talked about last time, and then we'll start moving into some of the new stuff. The new things that we're going to talk about are protecting the secrets within our templates, what a deployment scope is, how we would use a module, making decisions in our templates off of conditional statements, and running through some different deployment modes where we might want to loop through something. The example that we're going to use here is one that I use daily, which is, well, not daily, but regularly, which is if I have a stack that I'm deploying, I need one for QA, dev, and production for pretty much everything I make. And so I use the same template to deploy all three and just name them appropriately. So let's take a look then at how we would handle the secrets, right? So if we want to deploy a template using a secret, well, let me go back. Let's start with, why don't we do a little review? So yeah, thinking back to what we did on the first one, the structure of a Bicep file is you have parameter blocks, variable blocks, resource blocks, and then output blocks, right? So the parameter blocks are things that we can utilize with a parameter file, and the parameter file is what will be read in for each of those pieces. So if we did a value map right now, you can see I've got admin username as a parameter, and I've got admin username as a value for the parameter in a parameter file. So same thing here, right? Admin password, and then we've got admin password here. So that's the idea, right? So the parameters, they don't always have to be empty. So here you can see I'm establishing a default value for that parameter. So if I want something different, then I can come over here and add a value for that DNS label prefix. But if I don't add that in, as you can see on this file, right, we don't see DNS label prefix, then I'll just use whatever is to the right of the equal sign as that default value. So variables are things that I would deploy for this template that aren't values that I expect to be changed during the deployment process, right? So, my network is always going to be the same network no matter what we do. There's nothing about building this where I expect that to be something that a user is going to get to pick, right? So we've already got a topology that exists, and we're going to use that topology, maybe, right? Something like that. Actually, in some of my real stuff, of course, that would be a parameter because we have multiple networks. And then you have your resources, which are the things that you're actually going to deploy. Every structure of the resource comes with whatever you're deploying has a name that's associated with it. And that name is important because later on, like if we come in and take a look here, where's storage? Okay, wait. You know what? Nick will be an easier one. Well, there it is. So here's, you can see that for that storage account that we built up top, it's being referenced later on in the template right down here. So when you build an object, for instance, here we're calling the storage account STG, afterwards, all of the values in that object would be there for me to reference later if I need to. Another example that's on here is the NIC. So here you can see this is me creating the NIC resource. And then later I need to associate that NIC with the VM that we're creating. And I just do that by passing in the ID of the NIC that was created, referencing the NIC resource object above, right? So that's kind of the structure. Oh, and finally the output. So anything that you want after it deploys, any information that you want to be returned back to the console, you would use the output for that. And then it would be output, the name, what its type is, and then the value that you want to output. So that's kind of the what we covered last time was more about the structure and how a bicep file makes the ARM template, which is a JSON file, and then how we build a parameter file and then deploy the template with that parameter file.
And quick question, because I see a lot of people mentioning in chat like Ansible and Terraform. Is this something that you would use in conjunction with one of those tools, or is this something that would work in place of that, maybe with like a CI/CD pipeline or something?
Yeah, so that's a common question, right? So Bicep is a domain-specific language that exists to create an ARM template. The ARM template's the actual thing that you're deploying to Azure, and that's Microsoft's version of what Terraform would be, right? So, Microsoft has ARM, and then Bicep is used to build that. AWS has, what is it, Cloud Formation, I think is what it's called, or Cloud something like that. And then Terraform is like an agnostic version of what those things are. So it's really just pick your poison. For me, I only work with Azure. I only deploy Azure stuff. And I prefer to buy into the ecosystem. Microsoft is going to have ARM do the work that it's supposed to do for what it's making. If I wanted to deploy a Terraform, if I wanted to make a Terraform deployment for Azure, it's not the benefit that I'm buying there is the agnosticism, so I can use that same syntax across Azure and AWS and GCP, but I can't deploy it natively within any of them. I have to do some work in each of those cloud environments to even be able to consume the Terraform that I create and deploy those resources. And so because of that, as those public cloud environments change, you'll run into weird inconsistencies with something like Terraform because they haven't updated to fix that problem or something like that, right? So it's not to say Azure's any better, it's just it's a problem space that you're working in. Both of them have their own quirks, so you just pick the poison that you want.
Yeah, so I find you give up some granularity to have portability.
Yeah, so I find that it's easier and a little more consistent deploying Azure resources, with the Azure provided deployment tool, which is ARM. So and because I don't have a need to leave Azure and do something else, I'm happy with that. if I worked in both, Azure and AWS or GCP or something like that, then that would change. I would definitely look at a more agnostic thing where I don't have to learn multiple different formations for my deployments, but instead just learn the one and then deploy it across all the clouds. So kind of
Yeah.
just pick your poison.
There is Ian, I think is how you pronounce the name, raised his hand.
Yeah, yes. So I've come across a couple of websites where you could use a tabular interface to view and edit JSON. I pasted one of them. I personally find the tabular interface to be a little more convenient sometimes. Is there any tabular interface to edit Bicep?
So Bicep, I've only ever done it one way. I don't know what other tools might be available. I live and die by VS Code. And then again, like if we go take a look at my extensions, Microsoft treats VS Code like a first party thing. So I've got tons of Azure stuff inside my extensions, and one of those is Bicep. Um, and so when I do that, building everything that I want to do for building a Bicep file is quite simple. It's come in and just start building, and I get IntelliSense and auto completing, everything that I would want from um, an IDE and building it. I would also say Bicep is not JSON, right? So when we look at a Bicep file, this isn't the JSON. It looks a little JSON-y, but it's not. This isn't JSON. It's way easier to write what I want for an ARM template inside Bicep and let it build the JSON for me than it would be to have to actually write and consume the raw JSON.
Okay.
Other questions?
That's all. So.
All right, cool. All right, so let's take a look then at this first thing, talking about key vaults. So if we go take a look at my current subscription here, I've built this key vault, and it's inside a resource group called Shared Resources. And inside here, I've got a secret, and it's called local admin password. And here's my only time that I've written to it. And, I have the value right here, right? And then here's the identifier for that secret. So previously, when we deployed this VM, we deployed it with a parameter file that looks like this right here. And so in this instance, we were passing in our local admin password in clear text, right? Which probably isn't what we want to do. So you pass in admin password here. And that goes into this right here. And we're defining in our Bicep file that that's a secure string. So once it's read into Bicep, it's a protected string. But before it's read in, before we deploy that, it's just sitting here as raw clear text, which would not be a good thing. And so the way that you can fix that is when you come in and you deploy your key vault, you want to make sure that your key vault has that one. So you want to make sure here that your key vault allows for Azure Resource Manager template deployment. So you make sure you put a check in this box. Otherwise, the ARM fabric doesn't have permissions to read your key vault. By putting a check in this box, you're telling Microsoft to provide the ARM fabric, access to the ARM fabric into your key vault. And by doing so, we can change this thing here to look like this. So I won't change the template at all for this. What I'm changing is in the parameter file. And this is raw JSON. There is no other way to make a parameter file than write JSON. This is the structure that you would use. So just like before, where you specify the name of the variable or the parameter, and then inside the name of the parameters where you define what you're doing, instead of passing a raw value, instead you're passing a reference to a key vault. And then in that key vault, you define the ID for the item that you're using. And so here we can take a look that I'm calling for my subscription in my tenant in the resource group called shared resources with the key vault provider under Vault Criminy IAC, right? That's where we're looking, which maps to which maps to this value right here. Right, so this is that same value. Let me just copy, and we'll just paste that down here. Okay, so that you can see here, we're looking at that same exact string, right? Subscriptions, tenant, resource groups, shared resources, providers, key vault, vault, criminy. And then inside that object, I'm looking for the secret that is named local admin password. And that's what's mapping me from the key vault itself into secrets to that local admin password. And it'll return whatever the value of this password is into my deployment file. And this way, we never see the password, right? So I know that it's in a key vault and it's called local admin password, but I likely don't have permissions to read the key vault. And that's a cool part of this is, an example for us is there's many people that deploy VMs in Azure from the templates that I write. Those people don't have an ability to read out of the key vault themselves. So they can come in and they create their own parameter file and they deploy that with with the JSON that my Bicep file makes. And it deploys successfully because it's not about the permission of the user, it's about the permission of the ARM fabric. And so the user's got an ability to make a VM, and in making the VM, they need to be able to read that password. But I don't have to give the user access to the key vault. They just need to be able to deploy the ARM template. And so this is how you want to protect passwords, is use something like this, where you reference the key vault in your parameter file. Everybody feel good there?
I think so. I don't see any chat.
All right. All right. So then let's talk, the next thing that I want to talk about is deployment scopes. And actually, before we do deployment scopes, let's go actually deploy something else. I don't want to deploy this VM. We're going to be deploying some other VMs in a minute. So let's look at some things that we might want to deploy. So I've built a template for Bicep that works for my actual network. So let's take a look at how I've set up. So I've tried to build something that somewhat mimics what we would experience, right? So in a lot of places, you'll have many different types of resource groups for many different things. Typically, you'll have some resource group that has most of your networking and infrastructure parts that are shared amongst things. And then from there, you'll branch out into the resource groups that I'm using to provide access to specific groups for whatever reason, either for access control or chargebacks or whatever it might be. And so here I've built this shared resources OU. That's what's going to hold the network that we're using in Azure for everything that we're going to deploy. Here's all the subnets that we've got built. Oh, I already built that. I can't delete that one either. Okay, well, typically that wouldn't have been here yet. And I shouldn't have anything in here yet. I was able to delete that. Yeah. So, and so here, what we're going to do is we're going to take what I have for this. So I'm going to deploy to the shared resources group using the VNet Criminy core network with that address prefix for my Bastion subnet. Going to deploy a single public IP address, attach it to the jump box for Azure Bastion. And of these values, I'm going to use them across each of their resources here, right? So first we have to define the VNet. So that's where the VNet is. Then we're going to define the Azure Bastion subnet. Then we're going to define our public IP address. And then we're going to actually deploy Azure Bastion completely. And we'll use this one as a way to kind of look and see how we would deploy something. So I've already run Connect AZ account. That's how we, get my PowerShell connected to Azure. And then to deploy a resource, you would use new AZ resource group deployment. And then we would pass a name for the deployment. So we'll call this Azure Bastion. And then specify the resource group that you want to deploy to. We're going to deploy this to shared resources. And then the template that we're going to use, where am I at right now? I'm in Azure. So we're going to go to Bicep, Bastion. Hold on. And we're going to do bastion.json. That's what we want to do. Then we would specify template parameter file if we had one. In this instance, though, I'm not deploying a parameter. Everything that I need to deploy this exists within this file here, so we can just deploy that. So this is going to take a minute, but you can see if we come over and take a look in our resource group under deployments, it is deploying right here, right? So here we can see I'm deploying Azure Bastion at this moment. And like I said, this one's going to take a minute. So I want to go ahead and kick that one off so that we can RTP to the VMs that we deploy a little bit later. All right, so let's go back to talking about scopes. So there's two actual deployments, right? So we just saw me use the new AZ resource group deployment. That's the one that you'll typically use because you're typically deploying resources into a resource group. However, there are things that you might use new AZ deployment for. For instance, I can't deploy a resource group into a resource group. I need a scope above a resource group to create the resource group. And so that's what new AZ deployment would be for. And then there are things that don't exist in a resource group directly. For instance, I might want to make changes to Azure policy or permissions on the subscription, right? Things like that. So none of that belongs in a resource group. And so you would use new AZ deployment for that. So there's really just these two commands that you would use for deploying a Bicep or ARM template. And you just have to use the appropriate command at the appropriate time. If it's going in a resource group, you're going to use new AZ resource group deployment. Otherwise, you're going to use the new AZ deployment. So when we build a file and we go to deploy it, you will only ever deploy inside a single scope. So what that means is, think about looking back at something like this. So one of the examples we're about to take a look at is deploy a VM and turn backups on. So I want to deploy that VM to my RTPSUG demos resource group. So in doing that, though, I have to be able to link it to my recovery vault and shared resources. So I can't deploy to the shared resources OU when I make the VM because the VM has scoped itself to the RTPSUG demos. So, and you'll know this, right? Because here, when I said new AZ resource group deployment, I specified a resource group name. That is my scope. I get to deploy into this resource group. I can't split and deploy resources into multiple resources groups from a single flat Bicep file. So you only get the one scope. If you need to change scopes, what we'll have to use is we'll have to use something called a module. And a module is, think of it like like you would a PowerShell module, right? So I have my script with a bunch of work in it, but I might want to leverage some other set of work, some other functions from somewhere else. And so I would import a module to gain access to those functions to do that work as well. So Bicep has the same concept. Instead of having resource to the left, what I might have here is module instead. And in doing so, I can point it to a different Bicep file. And we'll take a look at what that looks like here in a minute. So that's for deployment. There is a property that exists on many different resource types that is called scope. And this will let me read content from other resource groups in. So I might need to reference a network that exists in a different scope in order to create an IP address for my VM in the resource group that I'm deploying to. And so if that's the case, then I can go pull in that network so that I can use it later in my scope that I'm deploying in. If I just need to read the data from it. And so for those things, you can use scope, but that's not on every property or on every resource type. So you have to be cognizant of what types of resources you're deploying and whether that's available to you or not. So, and then for deployment scopes, I've added a link down here that'll take you in to kind of talk about what that looks like. So let's go take a look at how some of that might look. So here I have a template for building a recovery vault. And this one, I'm building my recovery vault called Criminy Backups. So I'm establishing a backup policy in that backup vault or recovery vault. I'm calling it, or it's going to be for backing VMs up. It's going to be a simple policy, and I'm scheduling it to run Monday through Friday every week. And it's going to run at midnight Zulu time for each one of them. Then in there, I'm specifying my long-term retention policy, so which ones I'm holding and for how long, and then outputting my vault ID when I'm done. Let me go over here again. And did I delete what was in here? Whoops. I don't know which one is this one? Uh-oh. Well, we might just leave this here. Let me just go ahead and redeploy that. Oh, that's why I didn't do this. I'm not going to be able to do that. Well, we can redeploy it. And what I can do is if we come to backup policies, Azure Daily Backup. All right, good. So let's do that. So CD RTPSUG. All right, so we've got my recovery vault.bicep. So let's go ahead and build that so that we can deploy it. So we'll use bicep build, and then we'll specify recovery vault.bicep. And this will create the JSON file that we need for actually deploying the recovery vault. So here we can see that got created. And so this is how Bicep looks, nice and pretty, clean, and easy to read. And then it generates the actual raw JSON, which is far less, in my opinion, easy to read. And then to deploy that, we're going to just have to wait on that one, aren't we? How do I make you go away? -8. We're going to go new AZ resource group deployment. name, call it Recovery Vault. Resource group name goes in shared resources. Template file, going to be recovery vault.json. And again, I don't have any parameter file for this one, so we can just deploy that. So this would go through if I didn't have the recovery vault and build it. Because I already have it, so it's something, another thing that we can review real quick is talk about the fact that, remember, the ARM fabric is declarative. So even though I have a recovery vault, by deploying this, it will go over and overwrite anything that was in here that isn't configured to the settings that I have in this file. So for instance, if I had a backup policy that, stated, 3 o'clock in the morning instead of 1 o'clock in the morning, then this would go and overwrite that to say 1 o'clock in the morning. So even if I have something that's there, using a Bicep template to deploy to it is valuable because it's about the output of the sum total of that template, right? And so that's what's going to happen here. So this is going to go through and handle that. And while that's deploying, let's take a look at how a module might look. So here I'm deploying the VM, and I've got, my typical parameters and my resources inside of my deployment template. So I'm using the scope here to identify my network, and this is how that syntax looks. So since I've got a virtual network that already exists, and Bicep will specify that I want to identify a resource and call it VNet. It's a virtual network. And then to tell Bicep that it's already an existing network and it doesn't have to make it, I'm looking for it. You add the word existing. And then I'm going to specify what the name of that network is, and then use scope and give it a resource group to go look for that value. And so right here, I'm essentially saying, go get the virtual networks resource that's named VNet-Criminy Core that's in the shared resources resource group, and we're going to identify that as VNet. And I'm doing the same for subnets, right? So within my virtual network, I have subnets, and so I'm going to identify that I want to go grab the subnets. They're going to be called subnet. Well, specifically, I want a single subnet, and that subnet is called subnet-general, right? And I'm identifying that up here with my variable. And so we're saying for the vnet.name, so I'm identifying this VNet and using its name, and then the subnet that I'm looking for in that virtual network that lives in the shared resources resource group, and then we're going to call that subnet because I'm going to use those later. So I need to go identify them now and store them in a way that lets me reference them at a later date. And so here, because we're going to be deploying this VM to the RTPSUG demos resource group, I have to specify scope. Otherwise, it's going to look for this virtual network in the RTPSUG demos resource group. And that would return nothing. So that's why we specify scope.
Quick question.
Yes, sir.
You have that existing part there. If you don't have that, and it does actually exist, does that break something, or how would you know?
In this instance, it would just fail because I'm not actually deploying anything.
Okay.
So if I wanted to make changes to this, then, well, one, this is where it gets like kind of weird, right? So if it existed and I wanted to deploy changes to it, then I would be able to go look at the properties that exist for this resource type and then expand this thing out. Like let's go back up to this one, right? So here, I'm not specifying existing. And I ran this earlier and it succeeded. It ran successfully. But it did that because I deployed it to the correct scope, right? When we ran the command to deploy this bastion, I didn't deploy it to RTPSUG demos. I deployed it to shared resources. So, and then in doing so, even though it already existed, it went through and made sure that that network looked like I have identified it here. So it's going to give me the VNet name of VNet-Criminy Core. It's going to put it in East US 2. It's going to create the network of 172.18/16, and it's going to create a subnet of 172.18.1/24 and name it subnet general, right? And that worked just fine. Even though I already had that network there, I know this got built into that network successfully. If I did that, if I tried to run this block of code for what we're looking at here, is that the right one? Yeah. For what we're looking at here, nope, hold on. It would fail because I don't have a VNet Criminy core to deploy, or like, if I took the existing out, then I would have nothing. I'm missing the requirements I need to deploy a brand new network called VNet Criminy Core in the RTPSUG demos resource group. And I wouldn't be able to use this at all. So this works because I've specified existing. If we took that out, then this wouldn't be valid. I would specify scope down here when I did the new AZ resource group, right? There's
it's almost like their parameter set.
Yeah. So yes, I could make this work without existing, without error, but you have to deploy it to the correct scope with the correct, with the required parameters or properties of that resource type for it to be able to do anything. In this instance, it's really small because I'm just retrieving the information about that resource type and storing it in an identifier called VNet. I'm not actually doing anything to that network. Same thing down here. I'm just retrieving that subnet general subnet and storing it in an identifier called subnet so that I can reference them later. So, and the existing is what lets me do that. Is that a good answer? Is that clear?
Yep.
All right. So yeah, so that's the first thing about scope, right? So the next part of this then is, we're going to go run this. And when we run it, like I said, we're going to run this into RTPSUG demos. And so I'm going to go retrieve each of those. I'm going to build me a NIC in the RTPSUG demo resource group. I'm going to build a virtual machine in the RTPSUG demo resource group. And then once that virtual machine's made, I'm going to associate it with my recovery vault that we just built so it can get backed up. So here, I can't deploy the backup part of that because that needs to be deployed into shared resources. So instead, you use module to be able to change your scope. And so if we look, you can see that I'm referencing the module. All of that work's going to be identified in enable backup. And then I'm referencing a whole different bicep file right here. And then in doing that, I'm naming my module deployment, and then I'm specifying the scope in which I'm running this deployment. And so this is kind of like telling the computer to do another new AZ resource group deployment, and then changing this name and this resource group name to match whatever's here and whatever's here, if that makes sense. But I'm doing it within the first command. So we're going to run this one. Like if we close this back out, like we're going to run this one right here. Well, first we got to build it. So let's do that. Bicep build, em deploy with backup dot bicep. It'll build me my JSON. And then here, we'll use this parameter file to deploy it. So we can make this be call it RTPSUG1, or how about SVR? All right, so I'm going to build a VM that's RTPSUG SVR1. It's a standard B2MS VM. The default local admin will be criminy admin. The password's going to be that local password, admin password, and we'll stick some tags on it. Cool. All right, so save that. All right, so then now we can do new-az resource group deployment. Name it, what did I just say? RTPSUG-SVR1. Then the resource group that we're deploying to, that resource group is this RTPSUG demos resource group right here. And so here's where I'm going to start with my concept of scope, right? The template file is then going to be the VM deploy with backup JSON, and the template parameter file is going to be VM deploy.parameter.json. That's what we're going to do. And that's all I'm going to run. And when I run that, it's going to deploy this file. Oh, well, it is going to deploy that file, but we're going to read it in Bicep. And it's going to deploy this, all of this, into RTPSUG demos. But when it gets to here, it's going to take this, and it's going to run another command of this all on its own that changes this name to be backup, and then the name of the VM. So this was the deployment inside shared resources will say backup RTPSUG. I should do a dash there. RTPSUG-SVR1. And it's going to do that inside the shared resources, right? And if we take a look, we can come up to that enable VM backup. Here's what that Bicep file looks like. And so it's just another Bicep file. And that's what's pretty neat about this, right? So there's nothing special going on. So if we think back like to our PowerShell ways, when we build a module, you're going to build these extra functions, and then you want to make sure they're advanced functions. And so we're going to add, that way we can get commandlet binding and stuff like that. You want to make sure that you have appropriate documentation for how that function should be used. So when the module gets pulled in, somebody can look at it, figure it all out. Right? There's a lot of metadata, I guess you could say, around the work of the function that exists in the module. When we're doing Bicep, because it's all declarative, that doesn't exist. A module just means go run something else, but the something else is literally just another Bicep file. And so here is what that looks like, right? So here we're taking the, if I wasn't going to build a VM, but I already had a VM and I just wanted to turn backups on, this is what I would run. I would just run this piece here and specify the name of the VM, the resource group of the VM, the name of the vault that I'm deploying to, all of these things that I would need. And then here we can see each of those resources. And you can even see a little bit of cross kind of linking, right? Because where in my VM deployment, I had to identify things in shared resources, here, I'm actually going to be looking back to the resource group for the VM so that I can go find the virtual machine. I need to be able to identify that VM. So we have to build the VM, and then we're going to come over here inside shared resources and identify our brand new built VM, and then turn the backup policy on for it. And we're doing that using this module keyword instead. So module, location of the Bicep file. And this is something I often will screw up. Make sure you get your locations correct. So for what I do at work, I have a modules folder, and then I build my modules out inside that folder, and then everything I build, I reference off of that parent folder with all the other modules. But if I give my directory structure of that modules folder incorrect, then when you go to do your Bicep build, it'll just complain and tell you that that Bicep file isn't where you said it was. And you'll have to go update and make sure that you get your file location correct. Because we were able to do Bicep build just fine down here, we're okay. And I don't have to turn this Bicep file into a JSON first, because if we go take a look at the JSON file that we just built, all of that work will be down here already. Back to the OS. Yeah. So right here, we're in this JSON file, we're creating a second deployment. And then that deployment's in the shared resources group. It's an incremental deployment. And then here's all the stuff about that deployment nested inside the first deployment, right? So I don't need to create anything more than 2 bicep files. And when I do bicep build on the we'll call it the outer layer, right? The one for the VM itself, the one we're actually going to deploy, it'll also take all of the bicep, that's what you linked here, what you referenced here, and build that as well into it. And so let's go ahead and run that. And it shouldn't take too long. While we can come over here, if we go take a look, we can see under deployments, my RTPSUG server 1 is currently deploying. So I can see that I passed in RTPSUG server 1 as VM name, sender v2ms as size. We're deploying 2019 data center into East US 2. My tags, admin password is empty because we're reading that out of the vault. And then what my password name is. And then the deployment template right here. And so this is it, right? So now we just wait. Oh, looks like it's mostly done. Creating the virtual machine now. It's already made the NIC. It's already built the other deployment. So we're just waiting on the VM to get built. How's everybody feeling so far? Okay. I can't see the chat, so.
Yeah, that has me getting you in chat.
All right.
So I'm assuming everybody's following along and doing well.
All right, so let's wait until this is done, and then we'll move on to the next thing. It shouldn't take but a second longer. There we go. Oh, I did see some red, though. What was that red for? That looks like something inside Azure went sideways. Let's go see if it's in the recovery vault. Oh, well, that would be why. Oh, there it is. It is not. Oh, that sucks. Because this should work. I know it works. I just deployed it not that long ago. So what we can do is just do, what do we call this thing? RTPSUG-SVR1. And RTPSUG-demos. Any backups, all of that's right. So I should be able to save you. Bicep builds. And let's see if it runs the second time. It might have, maybe there was some weird race condition that happened in Azure. But even here, we can still talk about how we can see the module working, right? So I didn't deploy to shared resources. Remember, I ran the command to, RTPSUG demos, right? Let's scroll up a little bit, just in front of this error. Yeah, so here I'm deployed to resource group name RTPSUG demos, and in doing that, my module is called backup name, backup VM name, and that's what we deployed here. So we can see where that running that module ran that second deployment here, and then it's complaining because it couldn't find some item, right? Some object. That's a weird error though. Normally, if that's why I said I think this is a problem with Azure over my code. But we'll see how this goes. We'll let that run, and it should come back and enable backups. We'll take a look and see. So that's scopes, right? So this is how scopes work. Scopes are done using the scope property if you are just trying to read some existing data. But if you're trying to create something, the only way to get that done is to use the module type for your resource, which is going to create a whole nother deployment in whatever other resource group you need to deploy to. All right. So the next thing we want to talk about is conditions and loops. So for conditions and loops, I just went ahead and threw in 2 different links for reading about conditions and loops. So they are very clear documents on how this works. It's not, functional programming, so this is it, right? This is as good as it gets. You just have this if statement, and if that condition is met, then what's inside it works. So, and then they show you different ways that you can use that if statement for your conditions. So let me show you how I use it. So yeah, see, it was some sort of race condition, because this time it succeeded. It ran successfully. We refresh, that'll say succeeded. And if we go take a look at our backup items, virtual machines, you will see RTPSUG server 1 is now inside of here waiting to get backed up. So we do know that the code works. Everything was fine. It was just Azure did something funny. Okay, so yeah, so let's go take a look at conditions. So let's show you. Let me show you what I do for conditions pretty regularly. So I went ahead and chose to use the same thing here, which is domain join. And so if we take a look, here we're, have the same typical, we're just building a VM template, right? So we can see I'm identifying existing networks and subnets just as you would in the real world in order to create a VM for a specific subnet network. And then down here, I have a VM extension for joining the domain. So, and in this extension, I'm defining the name of the domain that I want to join, the user account that I'm using to, connect as a domain admin, and then the password for that user account right here in order to create the computer object and join the domain. And I'm only going to do this if domain equals criminy. And so up top, which I think I want to add something as well. If we take a look, one of my options here, is is going to be the domain I want to join to. And so we're going to say our options can be the name of the domain Criminy or none as what we want to do. Let's go into conditions and build this file up. Bicep build VM deploy domain join. That'll make my JSON file. And then let's come over here into there and to this, and let's deploy, call this RTPSUG-SVR2. But we've already built one VM. We've turned backups on for that VM. And we're going to build a second VM, and we're going to join it to the Criminy domain, which is running on this domain controller right here, Criminy DC. So let's go, just before we do this, let's go ahead and log into that thing. And since we've deployed Azure Bastion, I'm going to use Azure Bastion to do it. And then we said the name of the Criminy admin, the name of the domain admin, and then because my password's already in Key Vault, I can just load it directly from the Key Vault and hit connect. And so now we've logged into a domain controller using Azure Bastion that was built right at the beginning of this talk. Yeah, this is too much. And if we come over here, let's do this. So get AD computer. And we said this thing's called RTPSUG-SVR2, right? We expect this to return an error. Cool. So there isn't an RTPSUG-SVR2 inside of the Criminy domain. So here we have RTPSUG-SVR2. And my domain value is set to Criminy, which matches my if statement, right? So down here, we said if domain equals Criminy, then do this extra work. So let's deploy that. New AZ resource group deployment name. Call it. First group is going to be RTPSUG demo. This file is going to be VM deploy domain join, and my template parameter file is going to be vmdeploy.param. Send it. Again, we can come take a look over here. And if we look at the deployments of our resource group, we can see that it is currently deploying. So again, we're just going to wait for this VM to get built. So if we go look, it's already built the NIC. It's currently making the VM. And then after that, we'll get to see this extension run, which will actually go in and connect to the domain controller using this account for that domain and this password to join this computer directly into that VM. So this is the way that you would, use a conditional statement. It's just if, and then in paren, the condition, you can have multiple conditions if you want, and then specify the work that you want to do after that condition is met here. And, in this instance, we've built the domain property to allow two values, Criminy or none, and only if Criminy is specified will I domain join. So we could come in here and deploy an RTPSUG server 3 and change this to none. And we would have another VM built, but this VM would not join the Criminy domain. All right, VM is made. So here you can see that it's currently running the extension. And so this is the part where it's actually joining the computer that it just built directly into that domain. Curious too. Let's go take a look. Did we set up? We didn't set up backups for this, did we? Nope. All right. So let's just give this a couple more minutes or seconds. Come on. That whole watched pot thing. Are there any other questions, Kevin? How's everybody doing?
Yeah, no, so fine.
All right. All right. Well, while we wait, let's move on. And then we'll come back and see that has succeeded in a minute. Let's talk about loops. So loops are done in a few different ways. So this is definitely one worth reading the article on. So we can run loops through an iteration of a range. So if I have an array of elements, then I can just loop through the array of elements directly, or I can loop through the array of elements by the length or by counting an index while I loop through the array of elements. So there's a few different ways that you can do this, and each one of these is unique to the, for why you would want to do it. And they spell out a lot of that across the document here. So definitely come and read this document. The one that I have as an example is what I use pretty regularly, which is deploying something across multiple stacks. And so here we have a template that's going to deploy a SQL Server, and then I'm going to deploy inside that SQL Server 3 SQL databases. So, and we're going to use the AdventureWorks database that's one of the pre-built databases that you can define and just already get data populated. So, and it'll be done by naming each one QA, dev, and then prod across each one of them. So first, we need to go deploy that database server. So let's go do that. And that's actually up top here. And I would like to point out too, inside of this, another benefit of using Bicep over the portal is if you try to go create a SQL database today in the portal, you won't have an option to make a free database. However, there is a free variant that will cost you no money to run as a SQL database. It only exists though if you do it through Bicep. So we're going to go make the well, actually we can't. Okay, so I guess now we are. Well, yeah, we can. Watch this. Oh, I don't want a bash file. I need another PowerShell. All right, so we're going to go through here real quick and let's build the SQL Server real quick. So new-az resource group deployment. I'm going to deploy this into RTPSUG demos. The file is SQL deploy JSON template. Oh, that's all I need. I don't have a. Do I have? Oh, yeah, I do have a parameter file. Do it to that. Primary adventurers, yeah. Am I changing any of that? Oh, yeah, okay. So we'll call this RTPSUG-SQL Server. Yeah. Save. All right. And deploy that. All right. So we're going to deploy this real quick, and that'll get us a SQL Server inside of our resource group. because in my current, why did you fail? Did you really fail? That's it. That's all you're going to give me. Yeah. There's something going on tonight for sure. Okay, let's do this then. We'll come up here. Well, first, let's go see if it actually failed. Oh, it did. So we're just going to go ahead and redeploy the VM. And again, it's declarative, so it's not actually really doing much work. In fact, if we go take a look, most of this should jump right through here pretty quickly because the VM already exists now. It does not. Yeah, there's Murphy's winning tonight, it looks like. All right, well, let's see how that goes. Here we can see that the SQL Server has now deployed. And in here, I was able to deploy a single database that is an Adventure DataWorks database with a free tier pricing. So let's go back and take a look at loops while the domain join runs one more time. So like I said earlier, we're going to go ahead and continue to deploy that AdventureWorks database. Here, I have an expectation that the SQL Server exists already, and I'm just going to identify that as SQL Server. And this one, notice I did not specify scope. So that means that I expect the SQL Server to exist in the resource group in which I'm deploying the databases, which for this one has to happen. And then here's where I'm actually going to deploy the databases. So here we're making the new databases, and my loop looks like this right here. The syntax is going to be square bracket, for, and then just like a for each loop that you would be used to in PowerShell, item in array, and then colon, curly bracket, the information for what you would deploy. So all of this I write as though it's a single resource. In fact, I get it right by doing just a single resource first. And then once I know it's correct, then I can just come up and add my loop to the top of it, and I know it'll work. And so that's all we're doing here, right? And this is how you handle loops. And really, the only thing that's unique to this is I've taken this array where we're using deploy stacks, so QA, dev, and prod, and I'm using that as my iterator for the loop, and then specifying that value here. So we're going to see the DB name that I've given it, dash, and then it'll do one for QA, dash, one for dev, and dash one for prod, right? That's how this is going to work. We can take a look here. And so I'm expecting the SQL Server name to be what? RTPSUG SQL Server. So let's change that to SQL Server. I think that's all the parameter I need, right? So that's going to default to the location we're deploying to. I've already got tags. And then we could change the SQL Server database name if we wanted to. We'll go ahead and do that. Let's call this, so we can identify it as something different. We'll call it RTPSUG-ADV works, right? So let's save. And then CD. Hey, where am I at? Oh, CD. I went too far. So bicep build SQL bicep. And then we'll run new-az resource group deployment for it. Call this EB stacks. And we're putting this in RTPSUG demos. Again, the template file, database deploy JSON, the template parameter file is gonna be SQL. We'll send that. And so in this code here, using the loop, once this is completed, we'll see another set of databases show up on the SQL server, and they're all going to be labeled RTPSUG -ADV work or AdventureWorks dash, and then the QA, dev, and prod afterwards. Yeah, there's definitely something going on with Azure tonight. Because if we go back now while we wait on that, let's go back and look, and you can see that my last deployment for the domain join was successful. And if we come over here and take a look now, what? That was the server we deployed it to, right? Oh, RTPSUG server 3 is the one I deployed it to. No? Well, that's not good. You said you succeeded. Yeah, domain join. We passed in RTPSUG SVR3. If we come over in here, RTPSUG SVR3, I have a server. It has a IP address. What does this mean? Azure. Let's try and log into it and see what it looks like. So Criminy admin. Let's see what the VM itself says. It might still just be lagging behind a little bit. Weird. Yeah, that's weird. I'm not sure why that didn't work.
Can you look at the output from running Bicep real quick?
Look at the output from running what?
From running your command.
Yeah, I mean, well, the output's just whatever I told it to give me.
I don't know, I just thought it said somewhere like domain none or something like that.
Oh, crap. You're right. That's, this is why I shouldn't be jumping between things, huh? Yeah, so SVR3 set to 9. Prime and meet. That's why it took so long, too. They told it to make a whole other server. Right. Go ahead and do your saying. So we'll run that one more time now that it knows to try to join the domain instead of build one not joined to the domain. And while we wait, let's go bounce back to our loop and see how that looks. So that's done. So we can see that the loop succeeded. We just go back to looking for our SQL server. And we go look at our databases. So we'll still have the one that we deployed originally, the free one, but then on top of that, we can see how it looped through and built me the QA, the dev, and the prod database for each one as well, off of the name that we specified. So that's how you would handle loops. The other ways that you can do loops, like I said, are just by counting. So if I had a value that I just wanted to iterate across, or you might want to keep up with 1, 2, 3, 4 as you iterate from an array like this. And that's when you would use this one here, which I have found to be quite valuable as well. So those are all of the different things. Let's see. Are you done again? Nope, not yet. So let's give this one a minute here and see if it does what it's supposed to this time. And I guess a little housekeeping. So while this is finishing up, I am going to put all of this up on the RTPSUG GitHub. It's also on my own personal GitHub. And that I'll include the handful of slides that have the links in them, and then all of the bicep files that you see down here today. So, and I'll make sure to copy the Bastion and database files down as well, since those are useful. But my goal from this one was to try to be a little more, I knew this was going to be a harder one as far as like clarity goes, just because it is what it is. But I wanted to try to separate things into multiple resource groups and then actually deploy across different spaces so that you can kind of understand and see what it looks like. Nope, it still failed. And it's a problem with the extension. So if it failed like trying to actually connect to the data or like into the domain controller, you would get a different error, and then we could just go look, into the logs on the DC for it. But this isn't that error. This is an error with the extension itself, it looks like. This should work though. I'll make sure that this works before I upload the code so that I know that you have working code when you go to grab it. But I mean, I do this every day. That's all it should take. Yeah. And it's the same password we've used for everything, so that's all fine and dandy. Like I said, with the other weird thing, I'm going to say there might be something going on tonight. Oops.
Yeah, Microsoft knew you were giving a demo, so
That's Murphy. You know how Murphy goes.
they put you on the junk servers.
Yeah, I don't know why that's not working, but we'll make it right. And then I'll upload the code. But that's what I had for this evening. I hope it was useful.
Yeah, I mean, I see this as, because you've talked about this before in other demos you've done, is like how cheaply you can spin up stuff in Azure and mess with it,
Yeah,
break
I
it
mean that.
and spin it down. To me, this is like, if there's something you're wanting to mess with, this seems like a really easy way to kind of build it as code, spin it up, play with it for, a couple hours, and then just trash the whole resource group or resource groups, and you still have that code the next time you want to go mess with it.
Yeah, I mean that's how I use it constantly in my own personal subscription. I mean, I don't really pay much at all every month. I mean, I'll go show you what I pay.
Yeah, and I think I forget the other demo you had done, but you had done one where that was the whole premise, is like it's so cheap as long as you're cleaning up after yourself
Yeah,
that there's no reason you shouldn't be in here messing around.
yeah. I mean, I don't ever pay a lot of money, but that's why I stay very, you know, yeah. There you go. I guess in February I was a big spender.
Yeah.
Oh wait, no, look at that. April was even bigger, or I guess March, the month of March, I really went all out. But I don't ever spend a lot in here, but I'm really aggressive about cleaning everything up. Um, and because I deploy resources using infrastructure as code, it's not a problem. Like Bastion is expensive. It's crazy expensive to run Bastion if
Yeah.
you're just going to keep it up in perpetuity. But it's awesome. It runs great. It's an easy way to get to all your stuff when you deploy. It's fantastic. Uh, it's just expensive, but I don't keep it running. I just build it when I want it, and then I throw it away when I'm done. And the next time I come in and I go to work, I just redeploy my Bastion template. This thing gets run all the time. You know what I mean?
So Mike is asking
And
real quick, do you have any code that cleans up everything?
yeah, that's a good point. So remember, it is all of this stuff is declarative, right? Like it's about the end goal and not any of the work you do in between. So one of the coolest things for Bastion or for Bicep, or really just using ARM at all, is this right here. So I use this thing. This is how I clean everything up. So for instance, let's go take a look at what we got, right? So here we've got this RTPSUG demo resource group, right? And we've deployed a ton of stuff into it tonight, right? And a lot of this is, uh, built on itself, right? I can't deploy or I can't remove the NIC until I first unleak the NIC from the server. I can't delete the disk until, or the databases can't go away, or the server can't go away before the databases go away. And so if I just did this right here and then said delete, I'm sure we've all probably been there and done that, where you'll start getting errors about how the order that it brought everything in to go run it, it failed to delete them all. Or if you try to do it, here, under PowerShell, you just go get AZ resource and by resource group and then remove AZ resource, you'll get errors. And so you have to loop through like 3 or 4 times to get all of that stuff gone, right? So I talked about this in part 1, but the ARM fabric has 2 modes. And we actually saw when we looked at the scopes part where it was talking about the mode and it said incremental. So the default way to deploy something is always through the incremental mode, which means that I'm always adding on to what I have now. And so if you already have something and, you're changing the value, that value will change. But you'll never remove or delete anything out of the resource group. You're only creating the output of whatever you declared for moving forward. But there's another mode that you can use, right? So if we come in here and say new Azure or AZ resource group deployment. Whoops, hold on. We go to Bicep. Yeah. So I have this clear resource group JSON right here. So this isn't an actual Bicep file. This is just an empty ARM template. It's, you can see the structure, right? So outputs, resources, variables, parameters, all the things that we look at and use. So when we make a Bicep file into a JSON file, it's got parameters, resources, right? So all of those same pieces exist here. But I'm just declaring it empty all the way down the board. And so now what I can do is I can do new AZ resource group deployment, name, clear all, resource group, RTPSUG demos, template file. Then we're going to use the clear template file and then specify mode. This is the important one. Oh, and here mode, like I was saying, has incremental and then has complete. So by default, you're always running as incremental. But if I do complete instead, then what I'm telling the ARM fabric to do is to wipe everything and deploy exactly what's in this specific file. And so by deploying an empty file, I'm telling ARM to deploy an empty file. Everything else goes away. And it's going to be like, are you sure? You say, trust me, I'm a professional, and then you wait. And the cool part about this is because it's declarative, the ARM fabric builds this in a way that it's supposed to be done, and it just works. So instead of where you have to go delete stuff and then you have issues where I have a parent thing that needed to get deleted first, or rather a child that needed to get deleted before the parent, and you end up with errors and you got to go figure that stuff out. At least when testing, like for a development space, this is way easier to clean up after yourself. So whenever I come into play, I always have a play, resource group that I'm just deploying into. And at the end of it, when I'm done playing in that resource group, I just deploy an empty ARM template with the mode being complete, and it just wipes everything out for me.
No. So does this leave you with an empty resource group?
Yep. So when this is complete, everything that we did tonight is going to disappear out of this resource group. And in fact, if we do this, 12 records, what do we have before? I didn't pay attention. But we'll start seeing stuff deleting out of here already. Like it looks like the VM's already gone for the DC. Yeah, so now we're down to 5 records. Yeah, it's just cleaning itself up right now because I've told it that I want nothing to be deployed, essentially. And since the mode is set to complete, it's deploying nothing.
So if you did a new AZ resource deployment, not a group deployment, would that do something similar and just wipe out all resource groups in the...
I've never tried, but probably, yeah.
Okay.
I'm not sure what that would do, because that would try to do, yeah, that would be interesting. I'm not trying that on mine.
Spin up a free trial with a different email account and test it.
Yep, there we go. It's done. It's empty. So this should be returning back here in a second. There it goes, done. So mode complete. And we can see that it worked because it's all gone. So, yeah, so I think that's probably the easiest way to delete something is to do it this way. Well, like to delete everything. If you want to delete an individual resource, I probably wouldn't do that with a Bicep template.
Yeah, I think the question was about everything. So yeah, I think that covers it. Greg says, appreciate you sharing with us. Issues aside, it was an informative presentation.
Good, I'm glad.
Anything else anybody has? Thank you, everybody, for joining us. If you want to join us in person, if you're seeing this online, meetup.com, RTPSUG, go ahead and sign up and join us in person, and you'll get to ask questions and talk to presenters. Thank you for joining.